My apologies. Part 3. My um, the probability of my success in getting through this is dwindling in less than 5 parts, is dwindling by the minute. Again, my apologies. So, what do we have? We have not Henry, we have Louis the 14th. We have the Fronde. He survives the Fronde, is put down. He comes into his majority, and he basically rules with an iron fist. He establishes what's called the new modern army, the standing army, much the way that actually Cromwell had done things in England. Louis the 14th does so in France, also to take away the power of the nobility. Because if you have a military that is a function of the monarch rather than based on the feudal structures and the other nobles to bring the troops, but you have a standing army, you have the power to enforce your decrees. And that's one of the things that Louis the 14th did. Now, I have up there Bossuet, Jacques Bossuet, because Bossuet wrote a treatise called The Politics Drawn from the Very Words of Holy Scripture for the future Louis the 15th. Louis the 14th asked him to do so for the Dauphin, as it's called, the heir to the throne, which actually was not Louis the 14th's son, but grandson. um, and Bossuet, I'll say a lot more about him next lecture because he's going to have a major role in my discussion, or at least more of a role in my discussion of absolutism and of enlightenment there than he does actually here. But this treatise, Politics Drawn from the Very Words of Holy Scripture, is the most extensive, comprehensive expression of French absolutism there ever was. The editor of it, the translator of it, which is here in this book, Cambridge History, Political Philosophy, or Cambridge Texts of Political Philosophy, says, even so, the politics drawn from the very words of Holy Scripture remains the most extraordinary defense of divine right, absolute monarchy, in the whole of French political thought. Doesn't get any better than that. And this is a book that I would have loved to have assigned. But it's intense. It's intense. It's complex. And to understand it, you have to put it in the context of Bossuet's other works too. And he wrote up there, as I have on the PowerPoint, Treatise of Universal History, the Treatise on the Knowledge of God and the Self, and many other works. And he was very much a product of the Enlightenment. And yet he is claiming that political rule, political kingship is based on Scripture, and that piety and religiosity is power, and it is also based on reason. They're one and the same. And the rational position is to realize that absolute kingship, absolute monarchy, the absolute state is the divinely ordained political form as seen in Scripture and as discerned by reason. They're one and the same. Again, I'll say more about the relationship between faith and reason in the so-called Enlightenment next lecture. But this is a treatise that, too, is designed as a mirror for princes, and it starts with a letter to the Dauphin, the future Louis XV. It begins, God is the King of kings. It is for him to instruct them and to rule them as his ministers. Listen then, monsieur, to the lessons which he gives them in his Scripture, and learn from him the examples on which they must base their conduct. Now, I mentioned mirrors of princes. For Bossuet, his book, too, is a mirror for princes, at least for the Dauphin, Louis XV. written under Louis XIV, and reflecting the views of Louis XIV as well as Bossuet's own, because he was a very educated man. So was the Testament of Cardinal Richelieu, a mirror for princes. But what Bossuet is arguing is that the only real, valid mirror for princes are the scriptures, if we know how to read them and read them according to reason, because their God, who is the absolute monarch of everything, has revealed how kings should rule and on what bases they should rule. That's what is revealed in Scripture. Faith and reason from Bossuet. If you ask Bossuet, doesn't faith and reason, don't they contradict each other? Aren't they mutually exclusive? He would look at you like you were the most ignorant fool ever. And yet he was a product of the Enlightenment, a part of it. The work consists of 10 books. He wrote the first 6 by 1679, and then finishes beginning in 1701. He begins work, goes back to it, and finishes it in 17. What is this? I have this written down here somewhere, and I think I must have missed it. I mean, it's published in 1709. So I think he finishes it in 1708. Books 7 through 10. And supposedly he dies. That's what kind of happens. And it's not sure that it really was completed to his satisfaction in terms of he did some things up at the end necessarily. But it is a major work of French absolutism and the divine right of kings based on reason that necessitates rationally, according to Bossuet, that the concept of kingship has been revealed by God in the scriptures. It too is paternalistic. It is to protect the weak. It is to rule for the good of all. But it can only be done so if the king is an absolute ruler. And here he explicitly refers to the royal authority and royal power as absolute. Louis, you should be an absolute ruler over everyone. And again, the common people are like children that you have to discipline and bring into obedience. And the nobility are almost like teenagers that you have to bring into obedience in some ways. He doesn't make that explicit analogy, but he does talk about the paternal aspect of royal power and authority that is absolute. And in Roman law, let's go back to Roman law, the rights of the father were absolute. Father could kill his kids if he wanted to. Wives had some protections under the law, but not a great deal. But kids, they were property. That idea of the rights of the father was there, based on the model of God as Father. And what can God do? Well, God can do everything. God is omnipotent. And this concept of absolutism in France was that the king was not omnipotent, but was omnipotent regarding France. And with respect to the state of France, was an omnipotent, all-powerful ruler. Absolute all-powerful ruler. He wasn't omniscient. He didn't know everything that was going on. He has ministers. He has people helping him. He has this whole apparatus that Louis XIV built up in court to provide the instruments to bring about absolute rule, his own absolute rule. That's how it all kind of came together with Louis. And it got so far, too, in terms of, I talked about the tensions that had already been there. In 1618, Louis XIV revokes the Edict of Nantes that his grandfather had issued in 1598. So it didn't even last 100 years because of course we cannot have heretics within France because they didn't. Louis just side with the Catholic side, with the Roman side. Not completely. I mean, he also kicked out the Jesuits, and there's all kinds of religious controversies going on at the time. It's a fascinating period. Um, but it was more a policy of state. One law, one king, one faith. That was the idea. It always been. And Louis was like, that's what we're going to do, and I'm the absolute ruler thereof. And Bossuet, even though his treatise was written for the Dauphin, reflects the ideology of Louis XIV, who reigned longer than any other monarch. If we start from the time he was 9 years old, because he doesn't die until he's, oh gosh, in his 80s. What is this? He was born in 1638. He dies in 1715. So he reigned for over 50 years. Long time. And he stamped his image not only on France, but on all of Europe. He's known as the Sun King. And seen in this context, we can understand why he says, I am the state. It's not this feudal structure and the feudal hierarchy with his vassals, who basically were independent except by agreement. It's no, I am the state. I am France. And I am so because God has put me there to be that way, as we know, based on reason and based on scripture. And it's illogical and irrational to allow differing faiths. Now, that's the basic structure of French absolutism. There's no individual sovereignty. There's no concept of a social contract between the ruled and the monarch. Now, with Hobbes, there was, at least in that original state of nature, when individuals give up their sovereignty in the social contract to the monarchy or to the Leviathan, to the government, to govern absolutely, they lose their sovereignty. With Louis XIV, they never had it to begin with, because all sovereignty sits with the monarchy, sits with the king. So if you have any rights at all, it's only because I give them to you. Now, John Locke, who we'll talk about next week, our next lecture too, um, also adhered to a position of a social contract, but had a different view of things than did Hobbes. That's again in the English context. In the French context, all sovereignty is with the monarch, is with the king. Comes from God to the king. The concept that there could even theoretically be a state of nature with individuals having sovereignty was preposterous. This ideal, this vision, was then what made the French Revolution so cataclysmic, which we'll get to, I think, after the midterm. I believe it's after the midterm, the first midterm. So that's where we're kind of going. And we can't really understand what was going on in the French Revolution if we don't understand the emergence of French absolutism and the divine right of the Louis the 13th, 14th, and then on to the 15th and 16th, that they were the absolute rulers as the absolute sovereignty of having absolute sovereignty within France. And I have their Louis Wars because with that ideal, if that's going to be the case, we also need to at least assert what is right beyond France, internationally. You will read about in the textbooks Louis XIV's wars. A number of them, he's always kind of at war in some ways, both within Europe and also then in the Far East, as was Louis XIII a bit too. So it's this concept of French, and he's in the colonies, the French colonies, in the New World. So we see this all-encompassing idea of if I'm going to be ruling absolutely, I should rule absolutely everywhere. Not just in France, but of course, politically to bring that about was more difficult, and there was oppositions and conflicts and wars. But within France, Louis XIV was successful in establishing his authority, his individual sovereignty of equating himself with the state, meaning no one else had sovereignty or authority within France. That's what he meant by it. And that provides the background to what will be coming when we transition from early modern Europe to modern Europe. And we'll see that, as I said, I think after the first midterm. Well, at least I made it through in only 3 parts. So that's a positive. And if you have any questions, as always, please feel to email me, and we'll go from there. And do read Richelieu's Testament and keep Bossuet's treatise on politics drawn from the very words of Holy Scripture very prevalent in your mind as well. Okay, thank you so much, and I'll be back. Bye-bye.